Just by way of introduction, I'm a Pomo Coast Miwok Indian from Northern California. I'm an enrolled member at the Great Rancheria, where my aunt, who is 85 years old, still serves on the tribal council. So she's our family representative. What I want to do this morning with BJ's help is to walk you through the history of how we got to ICWA, and then what it looks like around the country, and then talk a little bit about the fact that ICWA really is best practice. I've been talking with states around the country about the fact that they ought to be treating all of their kids like ICWA cases. They shouldn't be thinking of ICWA as something special just for Indian kids, but this really is best practice for all kids, and that's why they ought to follow ICWA. It's been the law for 35 years, and we're still having trouble getting them to follow it. But if we can convince them that this is really best for everybody, including Indian kids, then hopefully we'll make some progress. I like to collect quotes, and this is one of my favorites. The test of the morality of a society is what it does for its children. By that standard, the United States is lacking. When I started as a judge 35 years ago, I used to believe that if I just did my little piece, then everything would be okay for the kids who came into court. I believed it was getting kids to 18 was a success. I've learned since then that that's not enough, and it's not enough because the system is broken. The system does not serve our kids the way it should. And what I use as a test for that is if it were my grandson who was in the system, would I be happy with how he was treated in there? Would I be satisfied with what it does to heal? What it does to put families back together? What it does to give him a future? And quite frankly, I wouldn't be. And for me, no would never be an answer. We would never reach the end of our efforts to help. And if I'm going to demand that from my grandson, how can I sleep at night if I don't demand that for your grandson or your niece or your daughter? So everybody wants what's best for the child. What I'm going to talk about for a little bit is why is there an Indian Child Welfare Act? The historical context for Indian children and the efforts to help. Let me start with the BIA boarding schools. Remember that the BIA started off as part of the War Department. And this is a picture of an early BIA boarding school. And you can certainly see the soldier with his rifle. The slide's a little washed out, but behind him is a barbed wire fence. In the background, you can see girls in dresses. Now, that soldier with his rifle and that barbed wire fence were not there to keep terrorists out. They were there to keep the kids in. This was not a voluntary program. Education was seen as the, quote, civilizing function. Well, the idea, quite literally, according to the documents surrounding the founding of these schools, was to kill the Indian and save the child. It was supposed to be the solution to the Indian problem. Started after the Civil War. There's a program in Virginia called the Hampton Institute, which was the predecessor to one of the historic black colleges, Hampton. Started off as a school for freed slaves because people were afraid that slaves who had been freed by the Emancipation Proclamation, by the Civil War, were going to resort to crime. And so this was an effort to try and help them. A man by the name of Colonel Pratt got the idea that if this worked for freed slaves, maybe it would work for Indian people. So they brought a trainload of adult Indian males to the Hampton Institute to try it out. After a few months, they decided this was, in fact, not going to work. So they got together and talked about it and decided that maybe they just needed to start earlier. So they decided to bring children to the Hampton Institute to try that. And there are stories written by the children who experienced this. As they grew up, they wrote down what happened to them. And essentially it was that the cavalry gathered families together at the fort. And they separated the children from the adults. And they herded the children onto trains. And there was no adult who spoke the children's language on those trains. The trains began to fill with smoke, and to the sound of metal grinding on metal, the train started up. And for 3 days and 3 nights, these children were on the train with nobody who could tell them what was happening, why it was happening, if it would end, or what might be waiting for them when it did end. When those children got off the train in Virginia, they took pictures of them, and you could see that they were poorly dressed and the fear behind their eyes. Less than a year later, you have a picture like this, where they're dressed like little West Point cadets. And I hope you appreciate the irony of the fact that these children, whose parents and grandparents, literally a handful of years before, were fighting the cavalry, were now dressed like little West Point cadets marching around. And this was deemed a success. So the following year, 1879, the Carlisle Indian Boarding School was founded. It was the first of the boarding schools, and was founded as a military boarding school model. The hallmark of these schools, for the first 40 years they were in existence, were the cemeteries that were attached to them. Because over half of the kids who went to these schools during those first 40 years died at these schools. In the museum at Haskell, there's a set of handcuffs. You can see the size of those handcuffs. Can you imagine the thought process that goes behind thinking that you need to create handcuffs of that size? So they taught people to be seamstresses, cleaning women, laborers. They did succeed, though, in breaking down the intergenerational teaching that happens in most Indian communities, where it's not just the parents that are responsible for educating kids. It's the grandparents, it's the aunts and uncles, it's the elders. We have generation after generation after generation who learned our parenting skills in the dormitories at the boarding schools. And then we wonder why there are problems. If in this country we were going to design a system intentionally to create dysfunctional families, this would be a candidate for what we would do. If our goal was to create dysfunctional parents, people who cannot parent well, this would be an example of what we might consider. And yet this was done in the name of helping. The research now is very clear that congregate care, group care, creates more opportunities for kids to be abused. The rate of offense is much higher. It didn't just happen in this country either. For those of you who like movies, there's a movie called Rabbit Proof Fence that talks about the Aboriginal experience with education. It talks about the story of a couple of girls who run literally hundreds of miles to try and get home. Not once, but twice. So let's jump from what happened 150 years ago to 50 years ago. 1958, the Indian Adoption Project was created. And this was a joint effort of the Bureau of Indian Affairs and the Child Welfare League of America. And we know about this because CWLA has issued a written apology for what happened. In the 1950s, CWLA was the cutting-edge thinking, the most progressive ideas about how to properly raise children. They were the go-to people for how to take care of children. They got together with the Bureau of Indian Affairs to create the Indian Adoption Project. And the project had as its goal the placement of Indian children taken from homes that were, quote, deemed unsuitable. What happened was that the states were actually paid by the Bureau of Indian Affairs to remove Indian children under the rubric of neglect. CWLA did not do all of those removals, but they were the pilot program. They were the ones who provided the theoretical underpinnings, the justification for doing it. But states were actually paid by the Bureau of Indian Affairs to remove kids under the rubric of neglect. Transracial placements were encouraged because the goal was to get those kids away from their families and away from their communities, put them in a white home where they then had a chance at a modern life. During this time period, 25 to 35% of all Indian children in the country were removed from their families. So let's jump from 50 years ago to 30 years ago. One of the last comprehensive looks at life in Indian country was done by the U.S. Congress when they created the American Indian Policy Review Commission. And the stories that you all heard yesterday, if you go back and read the transcripts from the hearings of the American Indian Policy Review Commission, the stories are almost the same. It's almost eerily the same. They did their study in the mid-1970s. The report was issued in 1977. Not coincidentally the very year before ICWA was passed. ICWA was passed the very next year with almost no dissent in Congress. When I was on the Pew Commission on Children in Foster Care, we made a series of recommendations for national policy and for state policy. One of the things we recommended was that the judges who make these decisions actually sit down and talk with workers, with therapists, with service providers, with administrators, with lawyers, not about an individual case, but about how to make the system better. I made that presentation to one group of judges, and they said, absolutely, that's what we want to do. They decided to meet together. A year and a half later, they invited me back. If I'd had any hair left, I would have been pulling it out over what they were talking about. Because they were upset at a police officer. A police officer had arrested Mom 2 o'clock on a Friday night. They're upset because Grandma lived around the block. And he let the little kids, 3, 5, and 7, go home with Grandma instead of putting them in a shelter. They had no concern about Grandma not being safe. Their concern was that those children might not then qualify for 4E, federal funding, because it might not be a licensed initial placement, which would disqualify the children for funding. And so they wanted the children to go to a shelter instead of with Grandma. And I'm going, we've lost our way here. The money is driving the system instead of our concern for kids. Those kids absolutely needed to be with Grandma. That was the best choice. But then I had to tell them, okay, if you want to follow the money, if your concern is so much for the money, why couldn't you at least put a cot in the shelter next to the kid's bed so grandma could be there? It's the children's sense that they don't need to be hypervigilant anymore. They can surrender that responsibility to somebody they know, not to a stranger, to somebody they know, somebody they have a relationship with. That's family. That's what was necessary. Western science has finally gotten around to the place that tribal people have known for a long time. Relationships, family, are what are essential for healthy children to grow. What's happened, though, is Western science is up here, tribal traditions are over here, and social work practices here in the middle, and they haven't made it to either way. So we have people who think they're helping kids, removing them into institutions or stranger care because it's already licensed. And what we're actually doing is we're hurting kids in the name of helping. In this country, 4E, which is almost a $6 billion pot of money, drives our social service system. The states get almost 60 cents on every dollar spent on social services for families, reimbursed by the federal government through various funding mechanisms, but the biggest is 4E. But the hook with 4E is the feds only pay if the child has been removed from home. They don't pay to keep the child at home and help the family get better. They don't pay to keep that child in place. They pay only after removal. So when administrators start to build service programs, they build programs around where they can get funding. And they can get over half of the cost reimbursed by the feds if the program is built around removal. So counseling for the kids, counseling for the parents is available after removal in most places in the country because that's where the services have been built. I know a lot of my colleagues who remove kids from their homes thinking that's the best way to get them the services and the help they need. Instead of asking, what can we provide to those children while they're still home that can help fix the problem? We have built a series of institutions now designed around removal of children as the first option. But it's an option that harms kids. I mean, that's what that basic research tells us. Kids are much better with people they know, with families and situations they know. And the more you stress the kid, the more brain damage you're going to end up incurring. We need to rethink how we do social services. Well, one expert came to us at the Pew Commission and told us that 60%, 60% of the kids who age out of foster care will be homeless, in jail, or dead within 2 years of leaving the system. That's not success to me. That's when I have to ask myself, if we did nothing, would they be worse off? When we take kids, we don't try and heal. We simply take them as the intervention. WestEd published a bulletin in January of last year where they did their own study, and they said that within 2 to 4 years, children aging out of foster care, over half were unemployed, 25% were homeless, and 20% were incarcerated. I think it's White Earth in Minnesota does what's called customary adoptions, where if mom's a druggie and dad's in prison, you need new parents, they bring in new parents, but they don't terminate the old ones. So that child keeps their grandparents, keeps their cousins, keeps their brothers and sisters. And the extended family basically adopts these new parents. But even the parents keep rights and relationships with the child. You just have a new set of parents who are responsible for the day-to-day care. The disruption rate for adoptions out of foster care, generally, the numbers range between about 25% and 50%, depending on which study you look at. The disruption rate for the 10 years that White Earth has been doing these customary adoptions is 1%. Shouldn't we look at doing something different? Where we can keep the kids connected? Clearly there are children who ought not be at their home. There's a sexual predator there. If it's a meth lab, they shouldn't be there. But that doesn't mean that they have to lose all the connections to all of their family. Because we're really talking about not punishing the parents, we're talking about doing what's best for the children. One of the things that I ask judges to do when I talk to them is to look at the case through the eyes of the child. When you're standing on top of a mountain and you're looking in the valley looks very different than when you're standing in the middle of the valley looking around. Reality hasn't changed. It's just what you see has changed. If we were to look at our system through the eyes of the child, we would probably not be very happy with what they see.
Today we've been asked to talk about the Oglala Lakota practice model. So I asked Richard Moosecamp to come today, and since he really is the voice of the people, in that he is practicing Wakaiyaska, that he has he grew up in these ways, and he has really very in-depth knowledge of why we live the way we live, and why our values are what they are. And so I'd like to introduce Richard to my right. And then on my left here is Roxanne Tubles, who is the Family Support Specialist Case Manager. And in the work that we do, we have been guided by Shiche Richard in creating our practice model. We want to do the work in a way that reflects the values and the vision of the people. I'd like to turn it over to Shiche. So.
Good morning. Lempetyki Santuashta na Vichus on Pelomitaku. Tiata, Ankash Kamunaka, Ankawa again, Horzamito Taloi. I want to say good morning to my relatives, and really honored to be invited here to participate and listen to the latest concerns and issues that face our people. One of the positive things about some of the horrible stories that we hear about our relatives, our children being taken away. There was a relative of mine that was a product of foster home, a long time ago. He was taken from his home, and but for him it was lucky because he was adopted into a Lakota family, and he was a Lakota kid, so he learned the language really well, and he grew up a real traditional guy. So the positive part of that is, sometimes this model that we're going to talk about today, it's designed with all the relatives, all the council fires in mind. If we all go back to the traditional way of life and the gifts and the teachings that our ancestors have gifted us, we will be well ahead on taking care of our own. I don't think nobody from the outside will come and solve our problems that we face today, but it is our people. So a long time ago, we lived by some laws. This training presentation was designed for the LOWO staff. I want to share it with the relatives today. A long time ago, when we put this practice model together, it was with our relatives in mind. The 7 prayers, 7 laws that we live by. And honey, one of my grandfathers, Joe Chips and Ellis Chips, their father's name was Harn Chips. We found an old recording of Ellis Harn Chips' father. And he talked about a lot of these that he wanted to share with the people back then. And I think that tape was recorded in 1930s or somewhere. But the laws that we make right here, the LOWO, if we put those back to our family structure, I think a lot of the children grow up healthy. What are the core values of the people? The people knows Wichozani. Must do with Wichozani. Wichozani means 4 things in our life. Kachan, Kawachi, Nagi, Nawaawachi. What is sacred to our people when we teach our children, when we tell our people not to hit our children? What is very vulnerable to our children today is Nasula. Nasula, the brain function, Kawachi. Wakanjaki, they really pick up everything. We train our people, we do our ceremonies so that they will be strong in these areas. Critical thinking, Then we go on to the next one. The health, just talked about how we all should be living a good lifestyle, but for some reason, we don't take care of ourselves, so we get sick. And then our feelings are really important. How we heard testimonies. It was sad to see all the people who talked about the things that they went through, losing their children. The damage is done when we hurt people, when we go through these traumas and go through these experiences. It takes a lifetime to get beyond these situations that we encounter. Nagi, woy humbly. In our way of life, the beliefs that we have, woy humbly, woy chala. Sometimes we get into a point where we don't believe in anything anymore. We lose hope. We lose our people, our children, the things that our relatives have went through. So I'm just kind of going quickly because of the time. My friend's sitting here, his stomach's growling right now. So, one of the old people said, the reason why we all go through these ceremonies is simply because our people have to live happy. A sad soul can kill you faster than a germ. To go on, strengthening the families. The practice model is work to help families become strong again. One of the ceremonies that we use in our practice model in LOWO is the Hunkapi. That is the most powerful ceremony that the Lakota people have. all the 7 council fire relatives, what helps us live, survive as a nation is the Honkapi. That is the main ceremony that Tiwahe, Otakwe, Washakapi, honoring the relatives. The history of a child, the spirit of Kota Wocheki, Wakanazaki, and honey, Woki Chang, the people didn't have any Wableni Chak. Somebody's always taking care of somebody, relatives. We lost a lot of these, so we feel alone sometimes. You know what? You know, we always talk about the suicide rates, and the reason why a lot of our people have the high rate of suicide is because of the isolation, the isolated feeling that our people go through. Even though you're maybe surrounded by a lot of people every day, if your spirit feels isolated, then you're in real trouble there. You know, the way that the temporary training our own people, building credibility, building sovereignty back into our families in Tiwai. 7 fires that Wayate, LOWO is there to help rebuild that great nation again. I'm going to go into an area where probably need Emily's help to talk more about the processes of how they put this to practice, because they're the ones that stay there every day and they enforce this model here. So we do cultural assessments. We do come in there and run sweat lodges for the families and do ceremonies, do conduct Honkapi ceremonies from time to time, but the ones that are really front line is Matunja and Mahanka there, that they're there every day. We're helping the people. The Honkapi is one of the main foundations of the LOWO, and helping the mental health issues, and sometimes we go there to have ceremonies and so forth. The sweat lodge and the healing ceremonies that go through the trauma and the grief that people go through in losing their relatives. Okay. So the families that we serve, our foundation there is bringing the sweat lodge to educate our people and putting the curriculum together so that our families can have a place to come to pray. Like the ancestors had a long time ago, they prayed for us to be here today, and I think we're the ancestors here today. All the people that are in here. If what you do now is what's going to happen in the future. So, just wanted to share these teachings, and I'm pretty sure Emily and all this information is in a PowerPoint so that we can share and work together in the future. The culturally based, the unique psychotherapy, utilizing our horses. I think some of the programs that are going on the reservations, I think I'm really thankful to hear that. Go ahead and go through all that. So these are some of the teachings that we have with what the practice models is. And I think I'll turn it over to Emily now, and she'll tell about how the administrative functions and how they enforce these practice models.
Thank you. That was a very brief, high-level description of what our practice model is about. So I wanted to share with you some of the ways that we provide services through our 4E process. And one of the things that makes us different from the state is that we do not do termination of parental rights. Also, I want to clarify that LOWO has jurisdiction over children on the reservation, and On Track, which is our ICWA program, has jurisdiction off the reservation. So the children that we're talking about are the children that we serve on the reservation. Most of the referrals and investigations that come to us, we immediately work to assess them for 4E eligibility. So we'll put in for an application for them. In the meantime, we'll cover them through our 638 monies. So then when the state reviews the application and they become eligible, then they reimburse us back, and then we reimburse the BIA account. So currently we have about we have 40 children that are fully funded through 4E, and there can be many, many more. We have probably 20 more that the state is working on right this minute. And then in our investigation and referrals component, we have probably 100 or more that are being processed. So it's our numbers are fluctuating. Our mission is to preserve and reunify, preserve our children's rights to be with their families and to reunify them as quickly as possible. So we are, under our structure, we are more flexible. We're a lot more lenient than the state would ever have been or could have even thought about being. And so a lot of our families will come through our system, and our investigators will look at why the children were referred to us, and at that point, our agency, LOWO, decides whether the children can be returned or should be returned. And the cases that become 4E are those where children have been abandoned or severely abused or neglected, and where our tribal court places conditions on them. So we are able to provide for a wide range of services for our families. All in all, we have right now, currently in our system, we have 380 cases that are 4E kinship and going through the investigation process. Our people, way back in 2000 and before, felt that our tribe needed to exercise sovereignty over the care of our children. And so I do believe that we are an example of what other tribes can do. We're working very hard to meet the needs of our families, applying culture. Some of our children, and it has been voiced by youth through a child welfare needs assessment, have stated that they really want to learn about the culture, the traditions, the ceremonies, and yet their parents may not want them to learn about it. Our social workers, when they're hired, they're asked if they would be willing to accompany a child to Inipi and to provide cultural education, and if they want to go through ceremony, that they be willing to go into the ceremony with them and to follow them through their service plan. And so we have made that a requirement. Also, because our nation has been devastated by alcohol and substance abuse, we require that our staff be alcohol and drug free. And this requirement came from the voice of the people, that we do the work in a different way. And I guess in closing, we've been doing comprehensive child protection services since 2008, when we went into the tribal state agreement with the state. prior to that, we were doing a lot of infrastructure building, capacity building, and that work alone is very, very, very time consuming because you need to create your own codes to support the work. You need to have the community's voice, their vision for what kind of agency that they want to see, and there's a lot of work that that needs to happen, but like Fort Gamble and our agency, we've had some experience in doing this, and we're happy to offer whatever services that we can to this effort. I'd like to ask my coworker Roxanne to speak to any thoughts that she might have before we conclude. Thank you.
Thank you, Emily. My name is Roxanne Jubals. I'm the Tutanganukwa Teoshaye Red Shirt Table. I attended the summit, and I was really excited about LOWO and what LOWO could do to help the other tribes. One of the things that I want to say today is that this is a hard road. It's a long time. LOWO's been in existence a while, and working there, it feels like there's so much growth potential. It's in its infancy right now, and it's just beginning. There's new issues that arise, like today we're all sitting here. We're addressing some different issues that have been unaddressed for a long time. LOWO has taken that step to save our children, and I think it's an honor to be able to be here to help you and to show you how you can start and begin your journey with your own children. The funding, I'm really interested in the funding. We attended a meeting last night. We threw some ideas around, and there's some avenues that we can address to get funding beyond the Baucus bill. And I'm really excited about that. I'm also excited about recruiting foster homes on other reservations. That's excellent. We do have children that are, some are in Rosebud or Standing Rock and Oglala, half and half. So we need to address that situation as well. Right now we have 30 licensed foster homes. We have also medical foster homes. And the reason we have medical foster homes is that there's a large number of prenatal alcohol consumption. So we have children that are born with medical deficiencies and FAS, or fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. So we have to address those things. And that's a reality of it. That's the reality of what's happening to our children now. And a lot of the times, the parents don't want to be compliant. Sometimes LOWO is a babysitter for them. If we remove their children from a home and their home and put them with kinship, then they'll say, oh good, well, we got 30 days, we don't need a babysitter, we can do whatever we want. So those are some of the odds that you're going to be facing in the development of your programs, and that's a reality of us. That's a true reality of Native people today. And I just wanted to express that, and I'm very thankful that we're here. Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
My name is Jolene George. I am a Port Gamble-Sklallam tribal member and the director of our behavioral health services within the tribe. And I have with me our department's attorney. The two of us wrote the Title 4E plan that we'll be talking about today, and we were happy that we came early enough to spend the week with you here, because we've learned a lot about some of the differences, but also I think are hopeful that we can provide you with some information that will be able to help you move forward. So a little bit of history of our tribe. We're very small. We're only about 1,300 acres. We're located on the Kitsap Peninsula in Washington State. We have a little over 1,300 enrolled members. About a third of them are children. And a little more than half live on our reservation. The rest most live within the counties surrounding us. We operate our own Indian Child Welfare Program and have since the mid-1980s. We have an extensive family code that protects our children in need of care. And we have our own tribal court that handles all of our cases. So the reason that we started looking at 4E, probably 10 years ago, and started trying to prepare our services and our things around that, because we believe that all of our children have a right to their culture. It was always difficult for us to locate a placement for children who do not have relatives, a lot of times able to take on that extra financial burden of having another person to raise. And until 1998, a family could only receive additional funds for that if they had child support or if they were on welfare or licensed by the state. So in 20 years, we only had 3 state-licensed foster homes on our reservation. We could not find relatives, so a lot of our kids were going off-res. Almost all of our kids were going off-res. The children that were being placed in our state-licensed homes were mostly non-native or other natives. So we started using tribal TANF to support our children. In 1998, we began a tribal TANF program, and the tribal ICW, which is under the same department for us, was able to help them secure tribal TANF for taking in their children. In 2001, just a few years after we started TANF, we changed our policy that a court-placed child could be considered a family of one, even if he or she was placed with their siblings. So those of you that know about TANF know that a sibling group is, you get a base rate. Ours is, right, currently it's, I think, $352 per child. It's like an additional $40 or $50 for the next child. So with our tribal TANF program, we count them as their own grant. So we pay the full amount for each child, and we do not require that they say they charge their children rent to receive their TANF. So it makes a big difference. It's still not enough, but instead of paying, for instance, like I said, a family of 3 would have only been $530. The tribe pays the $1,000 for these 3 children, so they get the rate for each child. Like I said, both programs for us are under the umbrella of social services. We're actually in the same building. So our Indian Child Welfare and TANF programs could coordinate fairly easily, oftentimes could fill out the paperwork ahead of time and walk it right down the hall to make sure there wasn't a delay in payment. We use TANF to help pay for clothing vouchers, emergency child care, and sometimes food. So because we started using TANF to support the Indian Child Welfare Program, we did see impacts on our tribal TANF. It can be used to support foster children, but it's not an unlimited resource, and we quickly saw that we were headed for some financial problems if we didn't figure something out. Families had to move out of our service area or become licensed for us to save TANF dollars. Our caseloads were not going down. You can see we were rising. We recognize that our children are not just citizens of the tribe, but that they are also citizens of the state, and that the state owes it to them to be providing them the same level of service. The federal law, ICWA, and state law allows for tribes to license their own foster homes. But unless it was a state-licensed home, the state refused to pay the maintenance payments for us. We then spoke with the Bureau, who refused maintenance payments unless the state couldn't pay it. The state would allow the tribe to become a private licensing agent, a child placing agency of the state, which means we use their standards and certify that the homes meet those standards, and the home is then issued a license from Washington State. That also meant, if we did that, that the state would have to investigate any of our CPS issues. They would come on the reservation, and our homes, the reason that we only had 3 homes licensed on the reservation is that they didn't want an outsider coming in to do those investigations. And we were capable of doing our own investigations for all of our child welfare matters, but for some reason we were not, in their eyes, capable of handling these investigations if they were state-licensed homes. So a big part of our process, too, is understanding how so many of the other programs overlap and enmesh with each other, especially when you're talking about child welfare with the realm of services that are involved. So we have a little bit about some of the other programs that we have within our department because they end up interfacing so much with each other. We started operating our own Child Support 4D program in April of 2002, and we were one of the original 9 tribes to operate a child support program under the interim regulations. We did not receive any of the startup money, and today we have approximately 450 cases. I think we're probably even higher than that now. We can establish paternity, child support. We enforce those orders. We also establish medical support, which you will, if you do not know already, will be most definitely doing if you're doing anything related to foster care. The child support program is based on achieving agreements between both parties. Our child support code is written as an agreement-based process, and the tribe does not go in and make recommendations on behalf of either parent. All TANF and foster care cases all are referred to the program to establish support and enforce them. And we have an agreement with the state that any cases involving tribal members and their children will be referred back to the program first for establishment and enforcement. About a decade ago, the tribe began discussions with the state to determine Medicaid and Medicaid eligibility for tribal members. It wasn't until 2007 that those discussions between the state and the tribe kind of started to become a little more of a reality. The state had to apply for a waiver to FNS to allow the tribe to determine food stamp eligibility, which I was trying to think of how food stamp eligibility came into it, but I actually think it was the state. The tribe was only requesting to do Medicaid eligibility, but we did have some encouragement from the state to also do food stamp eligibility if we were going to go that route. And so they applied for the waiver to FNS to allow the tribe to determine food stamp eligibility, and we were granted that. So an intergovernmental agreement was signed in 2009, which started a 5-year pilot project for us, and we have been determining in our office Medicaid and food stamp eligibility. So we can determine eligibility on the spot. We can issue their cards right in our office. I can't stress to you enough how much of a service that is for our tribal members. It's about a 70-mile round trip to our local CSO office, which is where they would normally have to go for those types of services. And transportation is a big issue for us. We did not receive any funds to do this. The tribe recognized the benefit and cost saving that would happen for us in the end. So we moved forward doing this program and budgeted for 2 full-time employees to run the program. We went through months of pretty intense training to learn how to use the state systems. But now tribal members can apply for and receive basic food benefits and medical coverage right on the reservation. We serve all Native Americans in the zip code. And we actually will serve anyone that comes in our office. Sometimes we have to transfer them to the local office, but we can at least get their application processed for them and get a card issued if it's an emergency. Low-income families access food stamps now, medical and tribal TANF all at the same time. We have more people coming into the office applying for benefits because they're more comfortable coming and applying for benefits to the tribal program. Families get medical coverage right away when they're coming to the tribal clinic, which lowers our costs because it goes back to the date of application. So with this, the tribe is eligible to receive match dollars. We get 50% match for Medicaid and 75% match for food stamps. We have an increased and faster access to Medicaid and food stamps for tribal members, and it helps our clinic get the encounter rate for Medicaid eligible visits that sometimes we were not able to do because people were still waiting or hadn't followed through with renewal certifications. So again, why is this part important to us? It's important because the more resources we have available to these people that are caring for our children, the more likely they are to be able to keep them for a longer period of time, right? So we have more people receiving food stamps. We have more people who are able to provide healthy food for the children. It provides that little extra benefit for them. And the biggest thing is that it gives us the opportunity to help tribal members get a medical child support order before the state issues one, because now we know the second someone's eligible for Medicaid or goes on to Medicaid. So our staff began drafting licensing standards. We used NICWA and Washington State as a model. And I meant to add this in here. We started our licensing process or drafting our standards through a SEDS grant through ANA. It was a 3-year project for us, and we would not have been able to do that without the additional grant funds. I wrote our licensing standards, and at the time was a child welfare caseworker with a more than full caseload trying to write the standards. And I assure you that those of us who have been working on this would have done whatever we had to do, put in as many hours as we had to do to make these things come to life, because it's something that was important to all of us to move forward with. So it would have happened, but it made it a whole lot easier for me to be able to stop, for us to basically fill my position as a caseworker and let me move over and just focus on the foster care program. We had a citizens committee made up of different tribal members within the community, lots of different ages, and made sure they were consistent with the S'Klallam Way. We spent a long time interviewing tribal members that had gone through the system, grandparents, aunties, kids that have aged out, talking to them about their experiences, trying to pull things from them that were important. We had our attorney review the 4E laws, ICWA, tribal code, to ensure that we complied with everything, and had our standards approved by tribal council. We actually skipped, so at this point, even though we have a good relationship with our state, they really weren't quite sure how to make all this happen. And so we had several meetings with them that we didn't have the right people at the table. And so we'd show up to a meeting and the decision makers that we needed were not present, and we couldn't move forward. So those meetings would stop, and we at some point decided we were just going to send our standards to Region 10, to ACF, and have them go through them for 4E compliance, which we did. And we then submitted them to Washington State and said, well, we've already had the feds review them, and they said they met the 4E compliance, so this is how we're going to do this. In a matter of less than 3 months, we had an agreement signed with the state of Washington to license our own foster homes. So we negotiated using a standard of foster home licensing equal to or exceeding the state. We haven't actually made any significant, I think we had one update to them with the Adam Walsh Act, but we haven't had to make any updates to those specifically since we wrote them. We use standards based on state and federal laws, not just state WACs. And in December of 2004, we signed our operational agreement with the state of Washington. In our state, we're able to determine our own licensing area. For us, just because we have a small area and not many resources available, we kept ours within our IHS service boundary, which is just within the county that we're in. We are looking to extend that a bit to some of the local tribes next to us that we'd like to partner with. So in 2003, we began discussions with Washington State to develop our 4E agreement. And in 2005, we signed our first tribal state 4E agreement and began claiming some of our children. Our staff worked with the DCFS state staff to correct existing data. We had a lot of errors in the state system. Some of our kids were not marked Port Gamble. Some of them had the wrong dates. There was lots of errors, and we weren't aware of them because we didn't have access to the state system at that point. So we literally sat with lists and went through each child one at a time and made sure their information was correct. We also were drafting our child welfare practice manual, which prior to this was all oral. It was a lot longer process than I think our attorneys had hoped for us to get an actual written manual, but it's something we're really proud of. It not only has the policy and practice that we want them to do, but it also has what we call a service tip in there. That is an actual direct quote from a tribal member as to why we do things that way. In 2008, we started drafting the 4E plan and really monitoring the legislation. In 2009, 3 years later, we had our council approve our practice manual for our child welfare program. And then we also unsuccessfully applied for the first round of the Title 4E planning grants. As I said, many of us on staff at that point really wanted to make this happen. We had been doing so much prep work for so many years that we were going to make this happen whether we had a planning grant or not. And I think for us it was a better route to go. We didn't have the pressure of the time constraints of the planning grant. It was difficult. I will say it's difficult. Andrea was trying to draft the plan as she's continuing to do the other work within the department. So it was extremely time consuming, but it was a priority for us and we made it work. And then in 2010 we submitted our first complete draft of the preprint and we're told we would have to resubmit it in a new format. We submitted our original preprint before the tribal preprint came out. So it got sent back to us asking us for a new format and then took quite a while for us to negotiate. But it did bring a new beginning for us. In 2010, we resubmitted our preprint to Region 10, and we began meeting at least twice a month, usually more than that, to go over the plan. And initially, we were kind of jumping around throughout the plan as we were going through, trying to answer their questions, making sure things were in the right spot. And I know that the regional office would tell you that it's not something that you negotiate, but we will say that we negotiated our whole agreement, step by step, section by section. And there were a lot of barriers that we'll talk about at the end. And it was a very testing and trying process for us, but it is worth it. We were very careful not to create or modify our tribal code if something could be handled by policy. And for us, we made one very, very small code change, and that's it for our 4E plan. We gave a lesson to our federal partners on how the PGST government operation worked and what the approval process was for even a policy. We talked at length about language differences. Language differences were our biggest hang-up through the plan. Their idea of guardianship, our idea of guardianship are different things. We don't use the word permanency in our tribal code at all, and we were not willing to do that. So there were a lot of differences that we had to work out and things that we had to teach each other. And then we had to spend a lot of time explaining the current tribal state agreement because in our region, they didn't even understand how our tribal state agreement was working and how it was going to work because, again, I mentioned we have a good relationship with Washington State, and in essence, we kind of flip-flopped our agreement, so we're their middleman now instead of them being our middleman. So our state continues to pay our foster care maintenance payments for our children, and instead of them giving us a portion back, we give them a portion back for some of the claiming that they do for us. So some of the barriers, and Andrea will go into more about the preprint part of it and some of these barriers here, but the language differences, as I said, were the biggest one for us. A lack of understanding, complete lack of understanding of tribal government. For us, really not including the state in our earlier discussions was something that we really should have done because the state could have really helped explain to the feds some of the things that they were struggling with and could have probably sped up the process significantly. We had a lot of past due payments from our state for maintenance payments. Figuring that out afterwards was kind of a nightmare. I'm not sure that we still really figured out the total amount that we are due, but we wanted to make sure they paid up on all of that before we went into a new agreement. lack of access to the state's data collection system. We do have access now. It's limited, and we're not sure how helpful it actually is for us. The lack of grant funds to support our costs. Our penetration rate actually went down, even though we had the same kids. We're still kind of puzzled by that one, trying to figure that out. I think the feds are a little bit puzzled by that too, but so we're working pretty closely with our region and the state right now to make sure things are being calculated and that they were being calculated the right way the whole time. And then for us, right now we're working on how we're going to be collecting and reporting our AFCAR data. So that's just a real quick overview of our PowerPoint. I'm sure everybody has lots of questions. We usually spend a pretty significant amount of time talking about the more technical details about 4E, but I will let Andrea talk a little bit about the process involved.
And I'll try and keep it short because it was a long process. It felt longer sometimes but you all know how that works already. In one of our initial meetings with Children's Bureau, I'm going to tell you this story just so you get a little bit of a snapshot. I always had to think of it that way when I was getting frustrated with our negotiations. So there were a group of us that went to one of the HHS tribal consultations. We do that all the time. You got to go to DC. And we had set up a meeting with Head Start, and we'd set up a meeting with Children's Bureau. Our first meeting was with Head Start, so if you've been to DC before, you go into that one building with the address, and then they walk you got to give them your driver's license, and you sign in, and they walk you through all of the machines, and then somebody escorts you up the stairs to wherever your building is, or wherever the meeting room is going to be. So I have my tribal chairman with me, I have a couple different directors, and I have another tribal council person, so there's quite a few of us. We go up to meet Head Start, we sit down in this one little waiting room, wait a little while, she takes us into this one waiting room, we have a really short 5-minute meeting, they ask us what we're doing afterwards, we say, yeah, we have another meeting, and they go, oh, okay, that's cool. We walk back down the stairs, we walk around the corner outside to the different address. We do the same process all over again, walk through all of the electronic equipment, sign in, get another name tag, and they walk us back up to the exact same waiting room so that we can meet with Children's Bureau in the conference room across the hall from where we just were. Welcome to negotiating your 4E agreement. So I always had to keep that in mind because honestly, they probably didn't talk to each other within those two services as well. For us, we have all of our services in one building. So Title IV of the Social Security Act, you have all of these social services. Title 4A is TANF. Title 4B is child welfare. I don't know what Title 4C is. I think it's been repealed. I don't know what it was before. Title 4D is child support, and Title 4E is your foster care and adoption. When we were able to get Title 4E directly, it was kind of a no-brainer for our tribe because we already did all the rest of it. So that was the last service that we really didn't have, at least out of Title IV. So as an issue and matter of exercising tribal sovereignty, there wasn't a question for us what we were going to do. And I did, and we all did, spend a lot of time arguing about what permanency really meant. I asked the question in that first meeting that I just told you about whether they had a problem with us following case management or practices that the federal law requires versus using the language that they use in those particular laws. And we were told, well, no, you can use your own language as long as the practice is fine. So That was the rest of it. That was the next 2.5 years. Oh yeah, but that's about practice, right? I don't need to use that word, right? The Regenton had to come back and think about that a lot, but they did. It was really good to work with them. Honestly, they were very helpful. They tried really hard to understand. 4E does really talk about how you can work with child support and how you can work with TANF and how you work with Medicaid. There's sections in that particular law that ties all of those services together. So it can seem a little overwhelming and it can seem a little bit of complicated, but at the end of the day, you are talking about your kids and somebody's life. So there's nothing more important than that. So if you have questions, let us know.
I just want to share that we've been able to claim anywhere from $60,000 to $90,000 each quarter through this process, and for us that at least pays for our foster home licensor and a bit of one of our time as well. So it has been extremely helpful for us, and we quite frankly wouldn't be able to provide the services that we provide without it.